All right. So last lecture we talked, in part one, we talked about psychological disorders and how they affect us as far as dysfunction, as far as distress, what it looks like as far as deviant thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, what we call the 3Ds. And we also discussed a little bit about labels. Then that's essentially what diagnosing is. It's assigning a label, a medical label or psychological label to a condition. And the reason we do that is why? Why are labels important in the medical field or psychological field? What did we talk about last?
We were talking about labels and how people can identify themselves and how that can be can do positive things and also negative things into people's life.
Yeah, because we do want labels for certain things. If we're trying to help somebody overcome a condition or features of a psychological disorder, we want those labels so that we can get them the right kind of treatment, right? So whether it's medicinal or whether it's some kind of talk therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy or whatever that might be, labels would be important. It's equally important for insurance companies because that's what they deal with. They don't just allow people to come into therapy and talk about whatever they want and not have any kind of end game or goal or direction for that. So it's a tool that the healthcare management system uses to pay for treatment. So if somebody comes in with severe depression, or if they come in with borderline personality or whatever it might be, the insurance companies will look at that to say, okay, that's something that we cover and we can provide treatment for, right? If somebody comes in and they just have, well, I just had a upsetting dinner and I don't feel well and I just want to come in and talk to somebody, it would be irresponsible for the provider to not assign some kind of label so that the insurance company can pay for that. Okay. And usually it takes the form of something like adjustment disorder, which is kind of the vague, it's just a very vague term, doesn't really follow anybody. It just means something's going on and it's creating some kind of dysfunction in their life temporarily. It's usually a very temporary diagnosis. So for some of the more severe ones, like severe mood disorders, we'll look at depressed mood disorder or anxiety disorder or specific phobia. For personality disorders, we might see something like borderline, I mentioned earlier. We might see narcissistic personality. Actually, it's very rare to see that in therapy, and I'll tell you why here when we get to that section. Or even more severe cases like schizophrenia, which is a neurological disorder, which I'll talk about at the through this as well. Okay, so let's look at some of these classifications. As I mentioned earlier, we have 20 categories in the DSM-5, which is kind of our manual for diagnosing and looking up specific conditions that wield certain disorders or contribute to certain disorders. So 20 categories, 520 diagnoses. Now it's a lot, right? I'm sorry, not 250 diagnoses. We got that backwards. All right, so let me share my screen so we can see what I am seeing. All right, so the first subclassification of disorders we're going to talk about are anxiety, trauma, and stress. Okay. Now, this is not a term that's new to us. I think we use this pretty regularly. It may be part of your vernacular, something that you use to describe a situation or an event or experience that you have gone through. But most certainly, these are not terms that are weird to us or foreign to us, especially anxiety, right? What are some things that make us anxious? What are some things that make you anxious?
Probably things that I wasn't expecting.
You have a good example this morning, right?
Well, a test, yes.
Yeah. Especially when you thought you were going to miss that test, right? So yeah, so test anxiety. Some people have test anxiety. What are some other anxieties some of you have?
Shamika took mine, but yeah, I was gonna say interview too.
Okay, yeah, okay, yeah, I see that in the chat. Sorry, I missed that. Let me move that chat over a little closer so I can, so when people respond, I can see it a little quicker. All right. So yeah, an interview, absolutely. What is it about an interview that makes us anxious? Why do we get that fight or flight for tests and interviews and things like that?
I think all interviews are so unexpected and you don't know what they're gonna think.
Right, right, because we have that invisible force. We feel that we are being evaluated and that we're being criticized, right? And we'll maybe talk about this a little bit later, but consider what makes you anxious. You know, what keeps you up at night? And anxiety at a very rudimentary level is just amplified fear over something that we're anticipating. Okay, so we're anticipating something to come up that we don't know. It's a big question mark, and we don't know whether it's good or bad. So we run through every scenario in our brains, and it can cause actual fear responses because of that. Okay, so presentations, right? Traveling. Traveling. Does traveling cause anxiety? I'm curious. What about traveling causes anxiety?
Probably planes.
Oh yeah, planes, absolutely. The fear of flying could be getting on a plane, Shamika put. Okay, okay. And that's a specific well, I'm sorry, that's a specific fear. It can be a phobia, and I'll describe what the difference is between the two of those as we move through this. Okay. So looking at anxiety disorders, we have phobias. All right. So the difference between a fear and a phobia, a fear is something that's real. It's usually, okay, it's something that we can overcome, like fear of a plane, for example. We could have a fear of flying. I have a fear of flying. Every time I get on a plane, my anxiety goes up a little bit. I always think in the back of my mind, something could happen. All right. And it takes a lot of self-talk to just kind of get through that to make sure. But nonetheless, I still get on a plane. I have a friend when I was in the service. Interestingly enough, I was in the Air Force, and this friend of mine, this coworker of mine, went through their entire career and never flew anywhere. They were stationed in the United States for pretty much their entire career, and every place, base to base that they moved to, they had driven to. And so I never thought about it. I never realized anything until a couple of years after I had gotten out. It's right around 2014, 15. I had talked to this individual, and they were in the process of getting a job someplace else, and they had a really good job before that. And they said, "Whoa, what happened that you're not working there anymore?" Found out that this person had a phobia, a fear, acrophobia, which is a fear of flying. To the point where they would not get on a plane at all, and their job required them to travel. So it didn't work, and they wound up having to take a job someplace else that required less travel or no travel via plane. So that's an example of a phobia. And if you remember from last lecture, we talked about the 3Ds, right? Does anybody remember what the 3Ds are? I kind of recapped them a little earlier in this lecture. What are the 3Ds for diagnosis? Anybody remember?
I think it was distress.
Distress was one.
I don't remember that. Well, I do remember, but I don't remember the words. Let me think.
Anybody want to help out? Distress is one. Think of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors.
Dysfunction.
Dysfunction's one.
Deviance, I think.
Deviancy, right. Deviant thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and dysfunction over their quality of life. Thank you, Chris. Yeah. All right, folks. So we got to step up our game here, get a little bit more excited about psychology. I know it's a lecture, it's online, but yeah, let's not have Chris take the whole class here, answer for the whole class. I know Toyin and Shamika have also been helping. All right. So anyway, that's what a phobia is. It's irrational, persistent fear of an object, situation, or social activity. And to caveat that, it's to the point where it causes dysfunction, where a person doesn't want to leave their house. They don't want to go outside. They don't want to go in public. They don't want to get in front of people, or whatever that may be, or get on a plane, whatever. If it causes some kind of dysfunction where they can't take part in their day-to-day ritual, then we can probably classify that as a phobia if we look at the length and the severity of it. So just a couple subclassifications of phobia are social anxiety disorder or social phobia, which is a fear of negative evaluation in social situations, whether they occur or not. So that means a person gets in front of a group of people and they have this perception that they are being negatively evaluated, as opposed to, even though they could be highly regarded. And we just got through yesterday, we got through a bunch of presentations with my college here in West Virginia, and talked with a lot of the presenters, and every one of them said, oh, I felt really nervous. I felt like everybody was criticizing and judging me and looking at me. Not everybody, some of them did. And in reality, I was in the audience, and I can say unequivocally that the audience thought they did an amazing job. So it's a very internal process for somebody that's going through anxiety disorder. And maybe some of you can relate to that, whether that is in actuality, they're being negatively evaluated or not, that's how they feel. So a lot of that, when we get into treatment next week, we'll talk about ways to promote self-talk or reframing in order to overcome those things. Specific phobias might be fear of an object, situations, or events. What are some phobias some of you have? Let's hear from somebody we haven't heard from yet. What are some specific things that you just absolutely can't be near or around?
I'm not a big fan of snakes.
Not a big fan of snakes. Okay, that's a pretty common one. What else?
Ducks.
What is it?
Ducks.
Ducks?
Yeah.
I've never heard that one. Okay, I mean, specifically, I mean, I've heard birds before. If you don't mind me asking, what about ducks? Is it that is fearful?
I don't know. When I was younger, I was at like this lake and there were just a whole bunch of ducks. And like, honestly, I used to love them. I used to feed them with my brothers and stuff like that. But like the
Oh.
one day I got attacked, and ever since, like, it's just been a no-go for me. Like, I freak out.
Okay. And that's actually very, very common. All right. And the reason why is because you have been, everybody has hardwired into us to fear things that we think might harm us. Okay. It's part of our survival mechanism. And if we don't have that, then we can always wind up in dangerous situations. So that phobia, it's not, I mean, it's somewhat irrational. And I don't mean that in a negative way, that you are in control of that, because you had an actual trauma from that. So it's almost related. I mean, maybe not to the level of PTSD, hopefully not, where you're waking up in the middle of the night and having nightmares about ducks. But some people go through those experiences where they have a negative encounter with something or someone that creates that fear, that long-lasting fear. Okay, so that's interesting. Yeah, but it makes sense. You know, I had a fear of dogs for a while because I got bit as a child. So it took a while for me to get over that. It took some work to get over that. How about some other? So we got snakes. Snakes are pretty common.
Darkness.
What's that?
Darkness.
Darkness. Okay. Anybody else?
I have a weird one. Mirrors. Mirrors.
Mirrors.
Yes.
Interesting. What is it about mirrors? Like just seeing your reflection, or?
I guess it's the same thing. When I was a child, I used to get scared with many stories and all that. So I can use mirrors like normal, but I cannot sleep in front of them, and I cannot see mirrors like for a long period of time. Like if I'm not distracting myself doing something, if I just look at the mirror like doing nothing, I will just get anxious.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. And again, they might be some of the stories that you imagine in your head that have been long lasting. So again, experiences are driving that. Strangely enough, I mean, not strangely enough, pretty common sense. So the 4 big things that people tend to explain they have fear the most are snakes. One of them is snakes. The other one are spiders. The third one is fear of heights. And lastly, public speaking. Strangely enough, right? How many of you have a fear of public speaking?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What is that from? I mean, have you ever tried to do public speaking, and what happened?
Yeah, sometimes you can just forget your lines, like you've already prepared everything in your mind, and you just get there, and the fear of seeing people looking and listening to you, you just go blank. Yeah.
Yeah. And kind of going back to those hardwired self-defense mechanisms that we have, is one of them is that we want to be favored among our peers. We want people around us to hold us in high regard because, again, kind of going back to social psychology and the need for affiliation, we have this ongoing drive to be connected with people. And the more that we view that as an importance, the more it can tend to guide how we behave around them, because we're always looking at them as evaluating us, right? So public speaking puts the spotlight on you. I mean, this is our perception, puts the spotlight on you and could endanger our standing within our friends, right? Within our peers, within our support groups. So anyway, that's hardwired into us that we don't want to jeopardize that. We don't want to risk losing our standing, our status with our group. And therefore, a lot of people have that hardwired fear of public speaking. So anyway, some interesting commonalities there that we all share. Now, some people might be a little bit better with snakes. I know a lot of people are snake handlers, right? They've overcome that innate fear because we all have that drive to avoid things that are different from us, things that walk funny or crawl or slither or whatever. To us, that's hardwired into us to consider that a danger just by propagation, how they move. Okay. So anyway, we talked about agoraphobia. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Did we? I don't think we did. Agoraphobia, it says fear of a place or situation from which escape is difficult or impossible. Now, the actual term agoraphobia is derived from fear of open spaces. And it's not necessarily fear of open spaces. What agoraphobia, it's like a secondary, it's usually a secondary phobia that occurs because somebody has panic disorder or has panic attacks, has a tendency to have panic attacks in public spaces. So what, again, kind of mixing that social anxiety with panic disorder creates agoraphobia, because that's one of the biggest fears, is that somebody goes into a panic attack in the middle of a marketplace or someplace, and that's going to be, they're going to be laughed at or judged or something like that. So agoraphobia, people tend to stay indoors and they don't go anywhere. All right. So again, some of these common anxiety disorders: fear of interacting with others, specific phobias, fear of specific objects or situations, agoraphobia. Panic disorder. We hear the term panic disorder and anxiety attack used interchangeably. And indeed, there are two different events that occur. A panic disorder, for example, is a disorder that when panic attacks occur more than once or repeatedly and cause persistent worry or changes in behavior. Okay, so many of us have probably experienced a panic attack. I know I have, right? What does a panic attack look like? Does anybody care, either you from your own experience or what you read or heard from others? What does a panic attack look like?
You start like hyperventilating, I think is the term.
Okay. Usually a few more symptoms in there, but hyperventilating is definitely one of them. What are some other symptoms you might see? Oh, it says right over here, examples, symptoms: racing heart, dizziness, rapid breathing, dulled senses, along with uncontrolled feelings of terror. A lot of people that have panic attacks report feeling like they're having a heart attack, that their heart is going to explode out of their chest, is what was described to me. So those would be an example of a panic attack, and multiple panic attacks or persistent worry that would cause panic attacks would be classified as a panic disorder. Now, anxiety attack is less intense, less frequent, and usually just has to do with racing thoughts, maybe some heart racing, and they might have to take a little bit of a break. A panic attack is much more severe, where everything pretty much stops and the person either needs to remove themselves for a period of time or recollect themselves somewhere else. Anxiety attack is a little less than that, okay? And then our other common one that we see with anxiety disorders is generalized anxiety disorder, which is just a disorder in which a person has feelings of dread and impending doom, along with physical symptoms of stress, which lasts 6 months or more. Okay, and that doesn't mean that those symptoms last 6 months or more. It just means that they frequently throughout the day, throughout the week, over those 6 months, have anxiety over something, and it's hard for them. It almost feels like it's impossible for them to get out of it. So we'll see that when people tend to worry a lot, and maybe you know somebody that falls under this category, but they worry about everything. They can't leave the house without worrying about where they're going to lose something, or that they're going to forget something, or that they turned off the coffee pot or closed the garage door, or even constantly checking their wallet or something to make sure it's there, right? So if they're constantly worried, over a 6 months period of time, and again follows those 3 deviant thoughts, behaviors, and feelings, distressing for them, and dysfunctional, we would probably consider looking at diagnosis for that. Okay. All right. So panic attack. I talked about this, so I'm going to kind of just breeze through that. I'm not going to go through the video. Generalized anxiety disorders, constant feelings of dread and doom, lasting 6 months. I talked about that. And one other important thing is the source of anxiety oftentimes cannot be pinpointed. So it's not like a specific phobia where we can tell what exactly it is that they were fearful of. It's usually just everything and anything, and not one specific moment. Okay. All right. And worry about things that most people would not worry about, right? All right. Other disorders related to anxiety. We have obsessive compulsive disorder, which I think a lot of you have heard of, OCD. Now, interestingly enough, we do have obsessive compulsive personality, which we'll get into a little bit later when we talk about personality disorders. But in relation to anxiety, it's usually just some kind of compulsion that is satisfied. Some kind of obsession that is satisfied with a compulsion. So for example, if somebody fears safety of some sort, you might see them locking the door, triple locking it, making sure that they got it 3 times and that it didn't come loose or whatever. Or if they have anxiety about sickness, we kind of saw that with COVID, didn't we? We saw a little bit of obsession with germs and disease and illnesses and bacteria and viruses, right? So what did people do? Compulsory. What kind of compulsory behaviors did people do over COVID?
Bought a lot of toilet paper.
Oh, yeah, maybe. Yeah, actually, toilet paper and paper products, it's actually something a little bit different.
No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. A real one would be like wiping the doorknobs.
Okay, all right. Yeah. People washing their groceries, right? I remember my partner had gone through that a phase where everything that came into the house had to be washed, even if we had it delivered by not Uber Eats. What am I thinking of? What's the grocery one? I forgot it. It's been so long since I've used it.
Instacart.
Instacart. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So even if you had it delivered by Instacart, people were still washing their groceries coming in. So that would be a compulsion, right? Because that's an action that settles whatever that obsession is. So that's what we look at with obsessive compulsive is the obsession side, which is constant reoccurring thoughts that create anxiety over something, over that thought, or the existence of that situation alone causes that person to get stuck in that moment. And then the compulsion is some kind of ritualistic or repetitive behavior or mental act to reduce that anxiety. Okay. and again, to the level of dysfunction. I think I had a video. I don't think I actually have a video for it here. But anyway, yeah, you might know somebody that does that. Like if they were almost 6 months out of COVID, but 2 years since it started. Hard to believe that. But if they're still washing their groceries and it's to the point where they can't go to the grocery store or shake hands or something like that, to the point where it's dysfunction, that might be something we want to look at, seeing if there's a way to reduce that anxiety so that they can function once again. Okay, so that's OCD. Acute stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Acute stress disorder symptoms oftentimes occur immediately after a traumatic event. So we most see this with natural disasters, with national disasters, perhaps even more commonly, we see this in wartime vets, right? People that are asked to do stuff extraordinarily that might cause extraordinary anxiety, stress, would be acute stress disorder. Now, this is a very temporary diagnosis. Usually, if it occurs right after that trauma has occurred, and it usually shows up as anxiety, dissociative symptoms, and nightmares. So dissociative symptoms are where we kind of separate ourselves from that situation. Like if you've ever been in an emergency situation, you act first and then you feel something about it later. That's what we would describe as a dissociative event. Okay, so ASD, pretty temporary. Usually we'll see it would be normal to see traumatic events scale back over time. We don't react to them nearly as much, like getting bit by the dog. Over time, it eventually, the more exposure I had to dogs, the better I was. Now, if I, 30 years later, 35 years later, I think I was 10 when that happened. I still get as heightened when I did when I got bit by that dog, even despite exposure to other dogs over this past 30 years. We would probably look at more severe case, which is PTSD. So symptoms include persistent ASD lasting longer than a month or can emerge as late as 6 months after the trauma. Okay, one thing to note is both disorders are no longer classified as anxiety disorders in the DSM because they're traumatic events. Okay, so it does include anxiety, but it's usually a reaction to some kind of stress that is long lasting and specific. All right, so what are some causes of trauma, anxiety, and stress disorders? And we can look at that from 4 different models. We can look at the psychodynamic model, similar to what we looked at in previous situations: psychodynamic model, behavioral model, cognitive model, and biological reasons. So psychodynamic model is described as repressed urges and desires trying to come into consciousness. So if you remember our talks about Sigmund Freud and the id, so all those feelings and emotions are trapped below the surface, and occasionally when they're triggered, they come to the surface and try and get some kind of resolution or develop some other kind of defense mechanism so that we're not affected nearly as severely by that. Okay, so but anyway, those suppressed or repressed urges, they create anxiety that is controlled by the abnormal behavior and thinking. Behavioral model looks at disorders behavior learned through operant and classical conditioning techniques. So for example, if we experience something that we have a fear of elevators, for example, how do we overcome those elevator fears? Some people might be inclined to get into more elevators and reduce that and kind of self-talk and reframe and rewire their thinking so that behaviors aren't nearly as scary. Opposite of that, what do other people tend to do to avoid or to not encounter fear? I think I kind of gave you a hint. What do you think?
I think probably like a process of self-talk and like small steps, like baby steps.
Right, and that's the healthy way to do that. If we find something that causes fear, somebody might move towards that fear to try and squelch the intensity, right? But opposite of that, somebody that, and this might not be this might be more of an unhealthy way to do it. How do they decrease that fear? What do they tend to do? What behavior?
Just ignore it.
Ignore it or avoid it, right? They move away from that, which doesn't resolve anything. It just keeps that fear perpetuating. And anytime that stimulus or that situation might occur, that event might occur in the future, it's going to cause them to move further away from that because they don't want to encounter the fear. So anyway, we're according to the behavioral model, we are rewarded by those behaviors and how we respond to them. The cognitive model looks at excessive anxiety comes from illogical, irrational, or thought processing, right? So it considers that it's not necessarily a fear of the event itself, it's that we've talked ourselves up, that self-defense mechanism that we have in our brain that protects us is making it much more worse than it is, to the point in some cases where it even will generalize. It spreads kind of like a mold. So it could be that we had a panic attack in a grocery store, right? And panic attacks happen because they're pretty regular, they're pretty common for some people. But because of that one event, the person has now generalized saying, well, maybe it's because I was in a grocery store that I had a panic attack. And what are they going to do? They're going to talk themselves into that, and they're going to avoid grocery stores. And then they're going to expand upon that. And they're going to say, well, maybe it's because I went to this town, or then they might expand upon that. So anyway, you kind of see the pattern going here is that our brain will create links to try and keep us from experiencing that re-traumatization. So that's the cognitive model. And then you have the biological model, which is the nervous system dysfunction or genetic transmission. So somebody could really have a panic attack for no reason at all. Okay, it's for some reason their heart rate goes up or their blood pressure goes up just because they're worked up. And because of that, their mind tells them that they're in a state of panic, and they just tend to run away with that, right? So that could be a biological means for that occurring. It could be hypertension. It could be just an increase of heart rate, could be neuropeptides or something that was released into the body that caused the heart rate to go up, and therefore creating some kind of anxiety, right? All right, so those were mood disorders. Next, we're going to talk about dissociative disorders or altered identities, okay? With this, again, when we say dissociative, to dissociate from something means that you are disconnecting. You're disconnecting thoughts and emotions, and sometimes we just work on autopilot. And if any of you have driven really late at night for like many hours, and you kind of just tune out and you just got that automatic pilot thing going, and you know, you're not really either here or there, you're not quite asleep, but you're not quite fully alert. That would be an example. I apologize. I think I might have to sneeze. All right. Excuse me. All right, I'm dissociating from my sneezing right now. All right. So anyway, so that's the idea behind dissociative behaviors, is that we are disconnecting emotionally from whatever that situation or event is and just kind of acting on autopilot. Okay. And we can see that through many examples. So types of dissociative disorders is a break in conscious awareness, memory, or even a sense of identity in some severe cases. So dissociative amnesia, for example, is memory loss for personal information, either partial or complete. So they may forget an entire event because they've dissociated from that. They call this, they say that this can be associated with or can occur with or without dissociative fugue, such like sudden travel away from the home. So they're behaving or they're functioning and they don't even recall that they've done that. And so dissociative fugue occurs when somebody either endures so much trauma that their memory just kind of completely steps away from them. Their awareness completely steps away from them. And then they'll get on a bus and then they'll travel across the country and become homeless for a while and then realize that then their memory comes back. Okay, so there have been reports of that having occurred. So that's dissociative fugue. Dissociative identity disorder is also when somebody has had some kind of trauma that is so severe that they have developed a different personality or a different consciousness to deal with that problem, with that trauma, and then swap back to something that's a little bit more safe and stable. Okay, so we've probably seen that depicted a lot in videos. I think most recently Split. Has anybody ever seen Split?
Is that the James McAvoy movie?
What's that?
Is that the James McAvoy movie?
Yes. Yeah. Yep. MK Shyamalan.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. That was. Did you see that one?
Like a few years back, but yeah.
Yeah. So that was a good example of what somebody might look like with dissociative identity disorder, minus the, I mean, he became a monster with one of his, like a physical, his body swelled up. There, as far as I know, there haven't been any reports of that occurring, but you got to cycle through. You got to see some of the cycling through some of the personalities that occur in that. Previously, prior to DSM-4, this was known as multiple personality disorder. Now we call it dissociative identity disorder. So if you ever want to sound extra smart around your friends at parties and somebody comes up and says, "Oh yeah, I think so and so," they might have multiple personality disorder. You can be extra smart and say, it's actually technically called dissociative identity disorder, but thanks for playing. All right, check out the DSM-5. Anyway, that's how I hang out at my parties. Anyway, so those are some examples of dissociative, and there are about 15 other diagnoses that we can go through, but those are probably the most well-known. Some of them contested and controversial, like dissociative identity disorder. I personally have not seen any cases of DID. I've had some patients come in and say that claim to have had DID, but oftentimes there were flaws in their story, and it didn't really necessarily hold up as that I believe that they had DID. They claimed they had DID, but after further investigation, it was obvious that they didn't. So psychodynamic, some explanations for dissociative identity. Moon Knight also gives. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just reading the chat here. So the psychodynamic gives an explanation. It points to the repression of memories. As you remember, Freud talked about events becoming so painful that a person had to repress those memories and step away from any of that regarding and stating that they don't recall anything that happened. So that's psychodynamic. Cognitive behavioral is trauma-related thought avoidance is negatively reinforced by reduction in anxiety and emotional pain, meaning that avoiding something or avoid thinking about something tends to be more pleasurable than actually dealing with it. So that's a cognitive behavioral model. And the biological model would be lower than normal activity levels in the areas responsible for the body awareness and depersonalization disorder. So it could be under the influence of drugs. Somebody might depersonalize or might lose track of awareness or encounter dissociative fugue. People that have experienced like anything with Molly or I'm trying to think what some of the other drugs that might have hypnotic effects. They might experience dissociative fugue where they don't remember doing something, but they were apparently in full control of their faculties outwardly. Okay. Now, I will say that disorder of mood and affective. Oh, yeah. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I misspoke. So we didn't cover mood. We covered anxiety. I will say that we do know for a period of time, the psychological community considered repressed memories to be pretty commonplace, especially in terms of childhood trauma. Recent studies and recent research has shown that much to the opposite occurs when we experience some kind of trauma, especially earlier in life. When something traumatic occurs, we almost have a heightened sense of awareness. We are aware of everything around us, and we can recall to some pretty accurate detail what's happening to us and how we feel about it in that moment. So the concept of repression used to be highly regarded. In fact, it was a center stage a while for hypnosis. A lot of therapists and psychotherapists would conduct hypnosis to try and extract that repressed memory. And that created a dangerous practice, because hypnosis is really the art of suggestibility, putting somebody in a suggestive state and getting them to open up about whatever thoughts or feelings or emotions that they're experiencing at that time or in the past. So what it does not do is uncover memories that are forgotten, because once they're out, they're gone. And the danger to that, if somebody was careless and reckless through their hypnosis process, their hypnosis treatment, they could actually implant a thought that somebody could recall in detail, even though it never actually occurred. So we learned it took a couple decades ago that we finally realized that eyewitness testimony and repressed memories were not as nearly as reliable as we had thought. Okay. Now, that's not to say people don't repress things, but what evidence is suggesting is that we avoid thinking about it. We may have remembered that, or we may have experienced that and stored it away in our long-term memory, but sometimes it's too painful that we choose not to bring it up unless we feel safe doing so. Okay. All right, so disorders of mood and the effects of affect, pronounce that correctly, the effect of affect. All right, so affect can be a verb or it can be a noun, right? We've learned that effect is the noun, right? But in the psychological community, we look at affect as being how we present ourselves to others through usually our facial expressions and body gestures. So affect is an emotional reaction to something that's going on, either thoughts, feelings, or externally, something that's happening, right? And then disorders of mood are disturbances in emotion ranging from mild to moderate, and can sometimes be so extreme that that safety would be a concern. All right, so major depressive disorder and bipolar disorders are the two that we're going to cover for mood disorders. So major depressive disorder. Hello? Hi, Dana. Did you accidentally unmute, or did you have something to add? Hi, Dana. Are you there? Hi, Dana. You there? Dana, can you hear me? There we go. All right.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Hello?
Can you
Hello,
hear me?
can you hear me?
Yep.
I'm sorry. I had just stepped away real quick because I'm at work. I was like on my
Okay.
break.
Yeah, you unmuted yourself, and I can't mute you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's all right. All right. All right. So, all right, back to where we left off. So the two that we're going to be covering is major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. Major depressive disorder occurs usually, it can either happen as a single event, or it can happen as over many times over the course of years. So what we look for with let's see if this comes up. Major depressive disorder is severe depression, sudden or no apparent external causes. So what that usually means is that an event could trigger major depressive disorder, or it could just be something internal that we don't quite have a handle on. So for example, if somebody had the loss of a loved one or somebody that they cared about and couldn't get out of bed for several months, and lost an interest in things, lost interest in eating, or maybe opposite of that was stress eating to cope with that. We could probably look at major depressive disorder. So anyway, it's severe depression, sudden or no apparent external causes, most common of the diagnosed disorders of mood, and it's 1.5 to 3 times more likely to occur in women than men. I would contest that and say that we are probably limited on that figure. Why? What do women do? Think about in terms of treatment and mental health. What do women do more than men?
Ask for help more.
Ask for help, talk about things, right? And I'm not saying that's universally true, but on average, women are more comfortable talking about emotions and talking about pain and suffering, as opposed to men who have the expectation by society to be rough and tough and not complain, right? Or not cry, even worse. So anyway, we might see an uptick in women reporting more depression than men because men just aren't reporting it, or they're not going to treatment, right? So that could be a factor to that. So anyway, I think that number is a little skewed, but it is accurate that 1.5 to 3 times more likely in women than men. Okay, as far as reporting goes. So bipolar disorders, what are they? Bipolar is a constant shifting between depressed state and manic state, or hypomanic state, which I'll explain here in just a minute. So let's see if I have a, I'm going to, see if my drawing is able to, come on. All right, so with bipolar, so we'll say the average person, we have this continuation of mood stability, okay? So mood, it's what we would describe how we feel, right? We may feel good, we may feel bad, we may feel great, we may feel awful, right? So there's kind of this varying mood in how we feel and how we respond. So the normal track for somebody that is functioning regularly, they're going to have ups and downs, but for the most part, we're going to see something close to that mood. We might see some ups, we might see some downs, but for the most part, we're pretty stable with that mood. Somebody with that experiences bipolar, okay, they might feel especially high some moments, right? So they might have this sense of this delusion of grandeur where they feel that they're really, really good at things, that they're the best, that they're highly regarded, that people love them, and they're rich and they're popular, all those things, all these hyperbolous terminology you might want to use, okay? So we call this part mania. This phase is called mania in bipolar, okay? Where things aren't as they seem for that person, right? They're describing themselves and viewing themselves much above what reality actually is, okay? So, and that can lead to problematic behaviors that we usually see right about here and here and here. So they might go out and they might buy things that they can't afford. They might go out and engage in relationships that aren't that aren't really good for them long term. They may quit their job or go on elaborate vacations or do something outside of their means of because their reality is that they deserve this, and that whatever reason, fill in the blank. So what happens usually about here is they hit some kind of breaking point where reality sets in and their money is gone, they're being evicted from their house, their relationships are disintegrating, and we see a sharp drop into depression. oops, I'll put that here, depression, okay? So after that dose of reality hits, they realize that that maybe they couldn't afford these things, or maybe that they are damaging their relationships. At either case, they hit this all-time low, okay, this really low point. Oftentimes, what happens, they enter into some kind of treatment, or they start talking to therapists, or they start to build themselves up in some way, usually through medication or help or something, to try and get them back to this level, get to this level of good, feeling more of a positive mood than more than a negative mood. Okay. Usually, like I said, usually with the help of medication that can occur. Some people might require more structured environments, like maybe even being hospitalized for a period of time. That can sometimes occur. Okay. So what usually happens is once we get to this point here, that positive mood, we try and maintain that with medication or therapy or something, so we can get on this track of, not so high highs or not so low lows. Okay. If for whatever reason, we always have to watch, because this period of mania can also create this illusion that the person is okay without medication. We see a lot of non-compliance with bipolar because they feel that they can get beyond that medication. They can get through life without that medication. And let's say they stop taking medication here, and we just see that cycle happen again until they get to this point, and then they crash again. Okay. So that's usually the trajectory of bipolar. Any questions on that? Or does anybody want to add anything to that maybe they've seen? All right. Let's see if I can get out of this. I apologize. We can see. I don't know how to get out of my. Oh, there we go. All right. All right. And like I said, bipolar and depression, they're usually pretty common. Now, there are some marked differences between, we have two subclassifications for bipolar disorder, bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 disorders. So bipolar 1 mood usually spans from normal to manic with or without episodes of depression. Okay, so we kind of see that level line where they get to good, but then they spike up occasionally during those periods of mania, and then they kind of go back down, right? Bipolar 2 is opposite of that. We would see that they would have normal mood with episodes of major depression and episodes of hypomania, right? So we don't see them spike necessarily up so high. That break of reality and delusions of grandeur necessarily don't happen. But what we'll see is that they'll be okay for a while. Things are, relatively positive, but then they have this sharp drop off for no reason whatsoever. And we've attributed this a lot to chemical imbalances within the brain. Fluctuating levels of serotonin and dopamine levels have been implicated in cases of bipolar disorder. Okay. So most recently, we've seen bipolar disorder and ADHD having a strong connection. ADHD, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. There is a possible connection between ADHD and adolescent onset of bipolar, meaning that people with hyperactive metabolisms, they tend to be, they have that sense of go, 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 go. And then later on in life, like adolescent years, we might see them exhibit more bipolar features. Okay, that's not to say people with ADHD are going to wind up with bipolar as a diagnosis. It just means that there is a connection and that there's some risk factors associated with that. Okay. Significantly higher rates of ADHD among relatives of individuals with bipolar. So we usually see that genetic within the family. And irrational thinking and mania are common in bipolar, but not necessarily present in ADHD. And lastly, hyperactivity can be present in both disorders. So people with manic that have the bipolar 1 they'll describe periods of feeling like they have just increased energy, that they don't sleep for days. We usually see that, we term that as hyperactivity, and we see that with ADHD and bipolar disorder. Okay. All right, so causes of mood disorder, again, behavioral. We link depression to learned helplessness. Okay, so again, we just stop working towards something because we feel like the more we work towards it, again, we see that with the avoidant behaviors. The more we work towards it, the more pain it causes. So we just learn to be helpless with that. We see depression in cognitive model. We see depression as the result of distorted, illogical thinking. So we're framing things in a way that makes sense to us, but may be illogical or distorted to other people, right? Because we're trying to protect ourselves. We're trying to make sense of the world, and no matter how illogical it is, we're likely to adopt that thought or that behavior. Okay, and then biological, as I explained, variation in various neurotransmitter levels or specific brain activities, and genes and heritability play a part of that, right? So fluctuating serotonin, dopamine, or norepinephrine would be implicated in mood disorders. Okay, on to eating disorders and sexual dysfunction. Eating disorders can take form in various ways. Usually, it starts with an irrational view of oneself. So somebody with an eating disorder might see themselves as constantly, I'm going to use the word fat. I don't like the word fat, but this is what I've had patients and clients describe to me, is that they feel fat. So with that body image, that self body image, every time somebody mentioned earlier, hating to see mirrors. A lot of people with eating disorders hate mirrors, right? Because that makes they see something that they don't want to see in that mirror. Now, I know, what you were describing earlier was probably a childhood story that lingers in the back of your mind, but people with eating disorders don't like mirrors for a completely different reason. They don't like it because they are seeing something in there that they don't want to see. And usually they're a bigger version of themselves. So yeah, they describe themselves as constantly fat, even though they may not, they may have a very low body mass index and very low fat percentage on their body. They might describe themselves as big. So that's where it starts. So the behavior, if we look at like OCD models, right? So that's the thought, that's the worry, is the obsession is, and I'm kind of just internalizing, I'm too big. I don't have a positive self-image of myself. I'm too big. So that's the obsession. The compulsion is to do something about it so that it for at least temporarily squelches that obsession, right? That the anxiety caused by that obsession. So anorexia nervosa, anorexia is when somebody stops eating or becomes malnourished. And bulimia is when they eat large quantities of food with attempts to squelch that hunger pain, or have the outward appearance that they are actually eating, and then they go binge, or they go purge it up later by throwing up. Okay. So anyway, we would classify somebody with anorexia as meeting actually this is a little bit incorrect here. So meeting two criteria is that their BMI is less than 18.5 as an adult, probably much less as a teenager, but they're using either laxatives or food restriction and excessive exercise used to control food intake. So they're controlling their food, they're not nourishing their bodies in attempt to lose weight. And then bulimia nervosa is binge eating with attempts to rid the self of food through inappropriate means. And binge eating disorder is uncontrolled binge eating, but no attempt to purge or use inappropriate methods to avoid weight gain. So opposite of that is they might be eating as a form to cope with some kind of loss, some kind of negative feeling, because somehow they're being rewarded by eating but not throwing up. It's opposite that they're not losing weight, they're actually gaining weight. Okay. All right, causes of eating disorders. Adolescents and young adults are most at risk. That eating disorders have been observed in non-Western cultures that are not focused on thinness. Now, when we say non-Western cultures, we're a Western culture, right? So what is about our culture that promotes thinness? What sort of things, give us ideas of what attraction looks like?
Can you repeat that?
What sort of ideas, where do we get our ideas of what attractive bodies look like?
Pro, like skinny.
Yeah, where do we get
muscles from? I mean, we get that from beauty standards.
that? Yeah,
But usually society put it, and we usually see it on the internet or social media.
right. We see on the internet, we see in magazines, we see on billboards, we see on television, you name it. In the past, prior to this past decade, thinness was highly regarded as healthy, right? It's what people were accepted as. Supermodels were thin, singers were thin. We're seeing that change. We're seeing that paradigm shift, which is positive. I think is in a positive direction for us, because we place too much emphasis on beauty and thinness, which gives people, that's the start of people wanting to be accepted and having that overcritical view of themselves, right? There is a genetic component for eating disorders, which account for 40 to 60% of at-risk for anorexia, bulimia, and binge eating disorders. Okay, so some things to keep in mind there. All right, some sexual dysfunction and problems that we might see as described in the DSM are sexual interest, sexual arousal, and sexual response. So sexual interest. Now, why is this? Why would this be something that is diagnosed? Why would we be looking at this as a disorder? Think about the 3Ds. What kind of dysfunction would a sexual would sexual dysfunction present in one's life? Why is sexual dysfunction a problem?
Problem with relationships.
Absolutely. Yeah. Somebody might not be in a meaningful relationship because they're encountering some kind of dysfunction. So it's really a battle that's, at least in the psychological world, it's a battle that's fought on two fronts, both with the person experiencing the sexual dysfunction and the person, their partner that's with them. Because for whatever reason, they have that relationship. If it's sex-based, usually that could be a problem, okay? If the other person, if their partner is not understanding. So sexual dysfunction can happen for many reasons. It can happen secondary to any kind of mental health issues that the person might be having. It could be a medical issue. It could be genetic. It could be loss of interest in that partner, whatever it might be. There are many explanations for that. But it is classified as a subcategory, as a category in the DSM-5. So sexual interest can look like female sexual arousal interest issues. They may not be as active or interested as they used to be. Male hypoactive sexual desire is oftentimes described as the male's lack of sexual desire, or even fanning out into the sexual arousal department where erectile disorder would occur, meaning that they are having a hard time forming an erection, which would hinder one's ability to have intercourse and connect with that person if that's important in that relationship. For women, genitopelvic pain penetration disorder occurs if the woman has pain, experiences pain during intercourse. So that might be a turnoff for them. That might detract from arousal. And then various sexual responses might also contribute to sexual dysfunction, which include premature ejaculation, female orgasmic disorder, where they may not have orgasms and it's not, again, as pleasurable or likely for them to repeat it, or for men, delayed ejaculation, which which means they're able to form an erection, but they aren't able to achieve pleasure. And again, just remembering that could affect the relationship if it's not secured, right? Or the partner's understanding. All right, last part that I'm going to cover today is schizophrenia. Now, schizophrenia is kind of a class of its own because we look at this as more of a neurological disorder than anything that anybody can really help. There's very little control a person has when they experience schizophrenia. So symptoms of schizophrenia are severely disordered thinking, disorganized thinking, bizarre behavior, inability to separate fantasy from reality. Now, I think I've talked about this in previous lessons. We as humans are two things. What are we?
Lazy and proud.
Lazy and proud, exactly. Gold star for you. With that laziness, right, we want to have a routine. With that pride, we want to make sure that the world makes sense around us. And when it doesn't make sense, it becomes very frightening and very concerning and surprising for us. So schizophrenia is the brain's ability, the brain's tendency to form oftentimes hallucinations or present ideas that aren't exactly correct according to everybody else. Okay, so for example, somebody with schizophrenia might believe that they're being spied on by Amazon, by Joe Biden, President Biden, by the Russian government, whatever, FBI, usually one of these super secret spy organizations. So that is the belief. They've adopted this belief that they are being spied on. Okay, so which, you know, we all have our different ideas of what's going on in the world. But for people that experience symptoms of schizophrenia, that is amplified to the point where they truly believe that they're in danger. Okay, so what do? Because of that pride mechanism, they start forming reality around that belief. So they might think that if I wear a metal hat or a bowl or tinfoil on my head, that my thoughts won't be affected. All right, they start believing that certain odd behaviors, kind of again looking at, you know, remedying some of those obsessions, right? Certain odd behaviors will prevent me from having my mind brainwashed or read or whatever, right? Same way with hallucinations. People with schizophrenia oftentimes experience auditory hallucinations. They hear things that aren't there. Visual hallucinations, what they see things or people that aren't there. Or olfactory is usually pretty common, which they smell or taste things that aren't necessarily present. So with that, again, they alter their reality. They're making a story up for their entire world so that it makes sense to them. They feel like they're in control and that they can do something about that. So they might interact with that hallucination somehow in order to remedy it, or they may ignore it altogether. So anyway, it can take many forms, but just know that a lot of it is usually overfiring of the dopamine neurotransmitters that create the sense of reward for them for acting and believing things that aren't necessarily in reality. So within schizophrenia, we have positive and negative symptoms that we look at. So positive symptoms are more of the kind of, I don't want to say cool, but I want to say less harmful, less intrusive. So delusions, you know, unshakable false beliefs. They believe exactly what it is that they're going through or what's happening in their lives. And hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that don't exist, you know, that's not a problem in and of itself. But when we go look over the negative side, they start to believe that they're less than or absent of or normal behaviors. So they might have poor attention, which could affect their job. They might have flat affect or inappropriate responses. They might laugh at things that other people are sad about. Or they might have interruption in their communication, which looks like poor speech production. Okay. Causes of schizophrenia, as I mentioned before, for the positive symptoms, you know, we see we see overactivity of the dopamine areas of the brain, and negative with lower dopamine activities in the brain. This is a pretty genetic disorder. So if parents have it, or if it's within the bloodline, we might see that passed down to other generations. Genetic support by family, twin adoption. So we do know that like if one identical twin has schizophrenia, most likely there's up to 80% chance that the other twin has that as well. Biological roots are supported over the lifetime prevalence across cultures. Approximately 7 to 8 people out of 1,000 usually develop symptoms of schizophrenia. Stress vulnerability, we also can, which suggests that people that have susceptibility to schizophrenia will likely develop that if they have high stress or some kind of a traumatic event that that triggers that later on in life. Okay. All right. Any questions, or does anybody have anything to add to that? All right. I know I kind of rushed through all those. We didn't get to personality disorders. Unfortunately, I apologize for that. But yeah, if you have any questions, your book will certainly answer whatever, you know, if you wanted to read a little bit further into that. If you have any questions at all, of course, you're welcome to use your discussion forum or email me, whichever. All right. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Okay. If nothing, thank you for your attention. It is Wednesday, so we won't see each other until next Monday. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Get outside, try and get some vitamin D. Enjoy your weekend the best you can. The end is coming soon. We're almost done with classes, and you can hopefully enjoy your summer. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank